Hello, and thank you for being here today for our 5th annual Montclair Literary Festival. I'm Jacqueline Morose, the festival director. Our festival benefits Succeed Together, a nonprofit based in Montclair that provides free educational services to underserved children. I want to thank all of our volunteers and festival sponsors today, including Rayo's Homemade, Montclair State University, the West of Hudson Realty, Jill Williams of Mindful Wealth Management, Ameriprise, Deirdre and Colbert Narcisse, the Crane Family Foundation, and all of our festival friends. Thank you also to the Montclair Public Library and Watchung Booksellers. If you have a question for today's speakers, you can click on the Ask a Question bar on the bottom right of your screen. We are so honored to have these two acclaimed authors here today to speak about Paul Auster's new book, Burning Boy, about the life and legacy of the great American writer Stephen Crane. Jayne-Anne Phillips, National Book Award finalist, twice a National Book Critics Circle finalist, is the author of 5 novels, Quiet Dell, Lark and Termite, Motherkind, Shelter, and Machine Dreams, and 2 widely anthologized story collections, Fast Lanes and Black Tickets. She is the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, 2 National Endowment for the Arts Fellowships, a Bunting Fellowship, a Howard Fellowship, and a Rockefeller Foundation Bellagio Fellowship. Welcome, Jayne-Anne.
Thank you. Good to be here.
We are thrilled to welcome back Paul Auster. Paul is the best-selling author of 4321, Sunset Park, Invisible, The Book of Illusions, and the New York Trilogy, among many other works. In 2006, he was awarded the Prince of Asturias Prize for Literature. In 2012, he was the first recipient of the New York City Literary Honors. He's also been a finalist for the PEN/Faulkner Award, the Edgar Award, and the Man Booker Prize. He is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters and a commander of the French Order of Arts and Letters. His work has been translated into more than 40 languages. He was born in Newark. Welcome back, Paul, and thank you so much, both of you, for being here today.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, Stephen Crane, genius explorer of the American and natural world, stands between us and pervasive mystery. His work deals not only with things human and natural, but with the force that acts in them, and so unites us who are utterly alone in a connected universe. 14th child of Methodist revivalists, Stephen was born November 1st, 1871. His text might be stated most succinctly in the end lines of The Open Boat. Quote, "When it came night, the white waves paced to and fro in the moonlight, and the wind brought the sound of the great sea's voice to the men on the shore, and they felt that they could then be interpreters." Paul Auster's shining new biography of Crane, Burning Boy, speaks to all of us on the shore, certainly in Montclair, which was once called Cranetown, and Paul will explain why.
Crane came from a family that had come to America early in the 17th century. And among his ancestors was the founder of what is today Montclair, which was called Cranetown then. He had antecedents even in the Revolutionary War period, for example. One of his ancestors, whose name was also Stephen Crane, and he was named after this man, had been head of the New Jersey State Legislature and had been at the Continental Congress and would have been a signer of the Declaration of Independence, if not having been called back on urgent political business in New Jersey. And this Stephen Crane was bayoneted to death by the British for not divulging information, as was one of his sons. And yet another one of his sons was I think a general in the Revolution in the New Jersey Army. And so,
Hey, how you doing?
Oh, I thought I heard somebody say something. So Crane, as he says, is a Jersey man from way back. But of course, he wandered far from New Jersey, and after his childhood, spent very little time in that state. He was a man who was everywhere it seemed.
Stephen's father, who was an elder at one point in at least of all the churches, the Methodist churches in Newark, once compared novel reading. It said novel reading creates, quote, a morbid love of excitement akin to the imperious thirst of the inebriate. And Crane remembered at age 9, standing in the parlor, scared to glue, polishing the handles of his father's coffin. Paul, how do you see the influence of such a strict religious faith on Crane?
That he was split, and this is the thing I think that makes him such a rich writer, is because while he turned against the religion of his parents and became, I think, as close to an atheist as you can be without declaring that you're an atheist, he nevertheless loved his father, and he was very close to his mother. I think his relations with his mother were far more complicated. His father died when he was only 8. So it's important to remember that he was somehow a mythological figure for Crane. But his father, for all the harshness of his religious views, was a very kind man with a very good sense of humor, apparently, and very warm. And I think those qualities affected Crane. But nevertheless, having been exposed from early childhood to this kind of harsh Methodist view of the world, I think it sank in, and Crane could never fully get rid of it. And you can even see in his prose, there are cadences that are biblical. It was drilled into him so deeply. And he still took pleasure in the music of the church, even when he had stopped having anything to do with it. So
it may also have been very connected to loss, the loss of his father. And then there's Agnes. I mean, Crane's mother was really a professional, even though she had 14 pregnancies in 25 years.
She had 9 surviving children.
9 surviving. The 4 children previous to Stevie died.
Yeah.
But she was very busy with the Christian Temperance Union. She traveled, she lectured, and she left the running of the household to her daughters, and she left Stevie to his sister Agnes, who was incredibly devoted to him and tutored him so well at home that he learned to read at 4.
Yes.
Agnes died, though, at age 28, as Stephen would. She died of meningitis, but that loss seems to me to have been a very important one, the fact that he was twice orphaned when he was 12 or 13 by Agnes's death.
I think Crane, he lived with death. It was happening to him at all the wrong moments. I mean, 8 years old, to lose your beloved father, who was only 60, and he died of a heart attack suddenly, unexpectedly. And then to be more attached to this sister who was older than he was by about 15 years, at the tender age of 13, to lose her was a devastation. He had a brother, Luther, who was a bit of a troubled fellow. I think he drank too much. But Luther worked as a flagman and brakeman on the Erie Railroad, and he, at age 23, died in a rail accident. He was run over by a train. So Crane lived through those 2 immediate deaths, even older than when he was 8. So I think he understood that, and I especially think with the death of his father, that for all the trumpeting about the glories and power of God, God was a cruel force that could take things away from you for no particular reason at all. And I think Crane's thinking about the world evolved into this world without God or gods, and in which man is thrust back on his own devices to sink or swim as best he can. And it's what we were talking, Jayne-Anne and I, a few days ago on the telephone. It's just it was a kind of position that was later mined and explored and expanded upon by the existentialist movement in the 20th century. Crane is a forerunner of that kind of thinking.
It's almost as though he was 100 years ahead of his time. He was a brother to all transgressors, to all of the fallen. He was very much attracted to the truth that wasn't obvious, the underclass, as they might have been called. Though journalism ran in his family, Stephen was drawn to fiction, and he wrote a draft of Maggie at 20, published it at 21 by cashing in his inheritance, the coal mining stocks. And in Burning Boy, you call Maggie a weird visionary poem, which I think will gain it more readers. How did Maggie itself revolutionize perspective in American fiction?
Well, in several ways. First of all, dealing with the lower classes, so to speak, the slums, was not so unusual. There were books about this part of the world, but they were always written by moralizers, people who wanted to find uplift and some kind of happy moral about the improvement that is possible for
wanted to do a few good works.
Yeah, do good works. Well, Crane was not interested in that. He was not a proselytizer, and I think the great strength of all his work, but here he is, just a boy when he wrote this. It's a novella. It's about an 80-page book, but it's the language is so compact and so bursting and so full of a kind of uncontrollable energy, and at the same time, a hard-nosed, unsentimental view of reality. He never judges. He's looking and explaining and describing what people do. And this is a violent world of cruelty and stupidity. And as I point out, self-pity. It mars the characters of all the characters in the book, except for Maggie, who is somehow this kind of static center of all the action. And as I say, she's presented almost as a sacrificial victim of this society. And
I mean, absolutely. And some felt, well, we see now that Maggie was a kind of the book was a kind of sacrificial victim, at least at the beginning. And around the same time, Crane released Black Riders, which also caused a lot of controversy and uproar. He was 23 years old, and one of my favorite poems from that book, these lines, quote, "A creature, naked, bestial, who squatting upon the ground held his heart in his hands and ate of it. I said, 'Is it good, friend?' 'It is bitter, bitter,' he answered, 'but I like it because it is bitter and because it is my heart.'" How did Crane deal with the very mixed reception to all of his early efforts?
Well, I think I quote that poem early on in my book because I think it's extraordinary. And the first line is, "In the desert, I saw a creature." So you imagine this enormous expanse. There's the cover of the book. This enormous expanse of nothingness and this lone soul devouring his heart. It's about how we cling to our own miseries and can't exit the trap that we set for ourselves. How did Crane deal with the attacks? He tried to shrug them off. I think they hurt. But he did write a letter to one of his friends. He said, "When I was the object of ridicule of 100% of the country's humorists, I carried on. And now that I am the object of only 50% of the country's humorists, I still carry on." And I really felt that he managed to do that. And he also never got his head turned when he was praised excessively.
He never really trusted the praise.
No, he kept his head down. And being a newspaper man himself, he knew the kinds of nonsense that was promoted in the press. So he didn't take it too seriously, I think. But of course it stung. Of course it's hard. Nobody likes to be crucified like that. When the book, The Black Riders, came out in 1895, that was in the spring. Red Badge of Courage came out in the fall. Imagine how compacted all these things were. It was from one month to the other. His life was shifting. But that book was praised by some, even Thomas Wentworth Higginson, the man who had been helpful in getting Emily Dickinson published.
He had basically good taste.
Yes, basically good taste. Higginson's a complicated character. But at the same time, There were more parodies written of Crane's poems than any other writer of the 19th century. Over 100 newspapers printed jokey spin-offs of Crane's method of writing poetry.
I mean, this is a time when, we have to imagine how important newspapers were. New York itself had 18 daily newspapers. That's how people got all of their information.
In English, 19 foreign language daily papers, not to speak of the fact that most of them were published in several editions every day. Every day. And even a little place like Port Jervis, New York, where Crane spent a good part of his childhood, I think there were 2 or 3 daily papers, and this was a town of 9,000 people.
I mean, one of the elements of Maggie that was so that caused such consternation was Crane's sense of the deceit and irresponsibility toward women by men. And in a way, he may have inherited some of this from his mother, who was so much against drunkenness because it affected women and children so drastically at that time.
Yes.
He said, we might call this toxic masculinity now, but Crane called marriage a base trick on women who were hunted animals anyhow. Although he courted society women like Lily Brandon Monroe and Nellie Krause, he counted so-called loose women as friends and lovers. And then we sort of move into the false arrest of prostitute Dora Clark, the Dora Clark affair, in which Crane witnessed an attempted false arrest by the New York police force of Dora Clark as she was simply standing on the street talking to a friend. Crane was warned, and he was aware that it was going to cause problems for him, but he waited 14 hours outside a courtroom to testify on her behalf. And Paul, what were the lasting effects of this?
Well, it's interesting to note that the commissioner of the police board at the time, there was a board, but there was the head of the board, was Theodore Roosevelt. He was 36 years old. There had been an election in 1894 in which Tammany Hall had been swept out of power all through New York State, and a reform Republican administration came in. I think the new mayor was William Lafayette Strong, and he appointed Roosevelt to become police commissioner. Roosevelt tried to kind of clean up the police and militarize it in a way, which is not surprising since given what we know about his later activities. And he was a great friend of Crane's in the beginning, and he was a huge admirer of Crane's work. Crane had been hired by Hearst. The 2 big newspaper publishers at the period were Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst. Each, the Journal and the World, each with about 1 million copies in circulation every day. Hearst hired Crane to do a series of articles about the Tenderloin, which was sort of the naughty neighborhood of New York. And Crane, he knew this part of town very, very well to begin with. But he went, and he was very serious about doing his research. He went to the court, the Jefferson Market Court, and hung out. And the night of the Dora Clark incident, he was out with 2 chorus girls. I don't know what they were exactly. They probably were chorus girls, but they were in what they called a resort, which was a club, a kind of nightclub. It was 2:30 in the morning, and he had been interviewing them, and they were about to leave when Dora Clark, a very beautiful 21-year-old prostitute who was a friend or an acquaintance of one of the chorus girls, came by, sat down. So the 4 of them talked for a little bit. Then they all left, and they went to 30th Street, right there in Broadway, right downtown, the Midtown New York. And Crane took one of the chorus girls to a cable car, leaving Dora Clark and the other one alone. And as he was walking back from the cable car after getting the other one on, he saw a man in plain clothes jump out of the shadows and arrest these 2 women for soliciting, because 2 men had been walking across the street but they had not been soliciting. Crane saw it with his own eyes. It was because Dora Clark had become the object of a kind of police hunt. She had gotten into trouble with the police. It's too complicated to go into now, and so they were after her, and these were trumped up charges, and they all went to the police station, and the chorus girl, Crane said, "She's my wife. She's not a prostitute," and so Becker, the policeman who arrested them, Becker, I should put in parentheses, who was later tried and convicted of murder and was the first policeman in U.S. history to be put to death in the electric chair. It was such a famous case that it was mentioned in The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Becker was a monster, and Becker went to the police station, lied about what had happened. The girl was put in a cell. Crane came back later. He thought about it and he realized, I can't let this go. And he went to the court the next morning, and they freed her. Well, she decided to sue Becker for false arrest. And that's when Crane was waiting for 13 or 14 hours to testify. He was exhausted. It was the middle of the night. And the lawyer for the police was so hard and tough and ruthless that he kind of destroyed Crane on the stand, revealing all kinds of things about his personal life. That
blame the victim.
Exactly. That was it. Discredit the testimony by discrediting the character of the person testifying. Therefore, Crane was harassed by the New York City police. It
was that detail about Amy Leslie that came out.
Exactly. And this was a young prostitute who Crane had been shacked up with for about 6 weeks.
He was living with her.
Well, shacked up is living with her. Yes, he was living with her. And it was so
certainly done by everyone today.
Yeah. So he was living with Amy Leslie, who went by 3 different names. Dora Clark went by 3 different names.
Sometimes you have to.
This was quite a story, which I go into at great length in the book because it deserves to. So because of this, Crane knew he had to get out of New York because he was going to be harassed till the end of time by the police.
He was actually hounded out of New York, and later, as we know, hounded out of his country. But to stay with this.
So then he was hired by his friend Irving Batchelor, who had a news syndicate, to go to Cuba and start reporting on the insurrection against the Spanish that had started the previous year. And but the launching point for getting to Cuba was Florida, Jacksonville, Florida. And as Crane was hanging around waiting for the boat to take him to Cuba, it took a month. He fell in love with Cora, this woman who ran a very high-class semi-brothel nightclub. He
wandered into the Hotel de Dream.
That's it, D-R-E-M-E. And she fell madly for him. He fell for her eventually.
She knew his work.
Yes, she was a reader and a very intelligent woman. Anyway, when Crane finally got on the boat to take him to Cuba, it sank, the Commodore. There were 20 people on board, and 7 of them drowned. Crane wound up in a rowboat, a dinghy, with the captain and 2 other crew members. And it took them 30 hours to get ashore. One of the 4 was killed in the attempt to reach these both of the breakers, the terrible surf that was keeping them from getting to the shore. And that inspired one of his greatest works, The Open Boat, which you described earlier. It's a piece of writing that is, I don't know, unequaled in American short story writing, it seems to me. A tale after the fact, as he called it. Yes. So then he couldn't get to Cuba. He and Cora finally became a couple, and he wanted to go to war. He wanted to see a war. He wanted to report on a war to see
This was after Red Badge, of course.
After Red Badge, which had made him enormously famous. I mean, he was the most lauded young writer, I think, maybe in American history, except for perhaps Fitzgerald's first early book. You know, the kind of book that transcends literature and becomes a cultural marker. So they went to the Greco-Turkish War, which lasted all of 1 month, but it was a brutal business, and they decided to stay together. Because Cora was married and her husband refused to divorce her, preventing Crane and Cora from marrying, they moved to England and lived as Mr. and Mrs. Crane for the rest of his life, which lasted another three and a half years.
We have to remember that he died in June 1900, so this was all packed into a very short amount of time.
Yes, telescoped incredibly. Of course, he didn't stay in England the whole time because he went back to Cuba when the Spanish-American War broke out and was there for about 8 months. And that was the thing that finally absolutely broke his health. He became very sick with tropical fevers
and malaria, yellow
malaria. He
fever.
had incipient tuberculosis to begin with. And this was a young man of great athletic prowess and been a tremendous baseball player. He was a horseman. He very, very athletically gifted, but he probably would have died earlier if he hadn't been so physically strong. But it got him. It got him. And at 28, after he had come back to England for about 16 months or so, he died. And this tremendous promise was just chopped off in midstream.
On the other hand, he had accomplished so much. He was really America's first modernist writer, our first rock star writer. And this moral code of his really lives after him, you know, in his work. There was a quote that I wanted to mention. You remember the piece that you look at very carefully in Burning Boy about Admiral William Sampson.
Yes.
Crane's moral code comes through in his words about that ship captain. Quote, "Men behaved badly to him, and he said nothing. Men thought of glory, and he thought of the management of ships, all without a sound. A noiseless campaign on his part, no bunting, no arches, no fireworks, nothing but the perfect management of a big fleet. Ultimately, he will reap his reward in what? In textbooks on sea campaigns? No more. The people choose their own, and they choose the kind they like." I mean, Crane seems so amazingly contemporary so frequently in the way he does things, in what he says.
But you should finish the paragraph. It's so beautiful how he wraps it up. Do you have it in front of you?
Well, people, you're going to have to buy the book to get the finish of that paragraph, unless you want to paraphrase it, Paul.
Yeah. Well, I have the book here, but I don't know if I'd be able to find it quickly enough.
Okay.
It's just that,
But also, what about that trip? He took a 4-month trip west. That was an incredible escape for him from New York. And it was his first time with an expense account, writing for the Bachelor Newspaper Syndicate in 1895. He met a blizzard and Willacather in Nebraska, which led directly to one of his most famous stories. He went to New Orleans, Texas, Mexico, and Burning Boy follows him every step of the way. What are your thoughts on the stories this trip inspired and the connection between his travels and his experiences to his fiction?
Well, I pose this question. I say, why one place and not another? And it was, why Faulkner wrote about Mississippi and he stayed in Mississippi, right?
Mm-hmm.
Joyce wrote about Dublin, living in outside of Ireland. Kafka wrote a novel called America. He never left Europe in his life. And I tried to say that even the most familiar places to a writer, once you are writing fiction about it, they become imaginary places.
Mm-hmm.
And dream territories. And why would Crane, for example, have lived in England for almost 2 years and had never have written a piece of fiction set in contemporary England? Whereas when he moved to New York as a young man, it produced a flood of stories and sketches all about the city. Why, after maybe, 10 days in Nebraska, would that inspire perhaps his greatest story? I don't know. It's a toss-up between The Open Boat and The Blue Hotel. These two are the
Well,
greatest.
I think even he was a famous synesthesiast, right? He
Yes.
saw colors not only in things but in thoughts. And I think the sense experience of The Open Boat and that blizzard were so connective, so deeply soulful for him.
I agree. I agree. So, but my argument would be that only the places that touched him deeply and stirred up things in his unconscious were the places that he wanted to use in his fictional works. Because I think Crane never understood what he was doing in the way that all great novelists and short story writers don't understand where it's coming from, and they don't really know why they're doing it and what it all means. It's a kind of a moment when you're trapped and you feel, I have to write this. That if I don't write it, I won't even live. My life depends on doing this work, and this happened with a number of places. Texas, Nebraska, New York, but also Port Jervis, which Crane transformed into a make-believe town called Willamville. Willam is a very interesting Old English word that means once upon a time. He wrote, I think, the other great novella after Maggie, The Monster, is all set in Willamville. It is a piece of such power, and it's about race in ways that no American writer was confronting at that time. None.
We're talking about these amazing stories, but you devote a lot of thoughts in Burning Boy to Crane's actual sentences. Crane said he wanted to write so as to be unmistakable.
Yeah.
And we can think about whether that means incapable of being misunderstood, or that the moment you read a Crane sentence, it's written by Crane. But what's your understanding of that?
Well, I went through this because it's a very strange word to use about what you're trying to achieve. But I think he means, I want to be immediately graspable. He was against any kind of literary pretension, any kind of frills. He
really social pretension as well.
Absolutely. I mean, he really wanted to go down to basics all the time. And so he wanted everyone to be able to understand. He wanted to be clear. And I think this is it's true. I think clarity is the most powerfully subversive weapon in arts. Willful obscurity or showing off always diminishes the results. It's just, you have to keep stripping back layers of yourself, and you have to forget even the fact that you might be talented, at least in the eyes of other people, and go down into the places that you don't know, the places that scare you, the places where you are lost. And that's where you're going to find the greatest work. And Crane did this again and again and again. And I think that's why I admire him so much. Ultimately, it's that artistic courage that he had, which is a human courage as well.
Burning Boy is a biography, but it's also a book by Paul Auster. Your homage, reportage, interpretations, questions are both objective and deeply subjective, writer to writer. When I started the book, I noted on the first pages, breathless, rampant, very controlled prose, like singing. That's
Yeah.
your prose.
Yeah.
Was it an oratorio to write? And we have a question from Liza. What drew you to a biography of Stephen Crane, among all others?
It was a mystery to me, and I kept asking myself, why am I doing this? Well, I can give you the chronological sequence. I had finished writing a very, very long novel called 4321. And I understood that I was exhausted, spiritually exhausted, physically exhausted. I needed time off. And so I thought, I'm going to give myself a little holiday for the first time in my life, really. And I'm not going to think about writing at all. I'm just going to read books, listen to music, and watch films. And among the things and the books, I wanted to read things I hadn't read and had been always meaning to read. And Crane was someone I had read young and admired a great deal, but hadn't really followed up on. And I started reading him again, The Monster being the first thing, and I was overpowered by how great this 60-page novella was. And I started reading more and more and more, and pretty soon then I was buying the Library of America edition. And after those 1,400 pages, I bought the 10-volume collected works of Crane. And at a certain point, I said to myself, wow, not enough people are reading Crane. He's not in the discussion anymore. What happened? This is one of the greatest American writers ever, and certainly the greatest of that period. So I said, I'm going to write a little book, an homage to Crane, an appreciation. And the little book got to be a very, very big book. The only thing I could think of to justify what I was doing was 4321 is a novel in which 4 potential stories spin out about the same person, whose name is Ferguson. So there are 4 Fergusons, and I kept saying to myself, Crane is Ferguson 5. He's the real living example of one of my Fergusons. And ironically enough, born in the same city, Newark, New Jersey. Other than that, there was some emotional connection I felt with Crane that I wanted to explore. I have no desire to write another biography about anybody else. And it just came as a utter fluke in the course of my own writing journey, I suppose you might call it.
There's actually a question here. Why do you think Crane's work went out of favor? It's actually gone in and out of favor a few times, perhaps.
Yes. I have no idea. I can't figure it out. When I was in high school, everyone was required to read The Red Badge of Courage.
They were reading it way too young, right?
Well, 15. No, not really. I remember we were sophomores in high school, and I remember how everyone loved it. And I mean, boys and girls together, and how impressed we were by the writing. And it is a book about a teenager, after all. It's really appropriate for high school kids to read The Red Badge of Courage. So I don't know. Other books came in and usurped. No one reads The Scarlet Letter in high school anymore, which is a terrible pity, it seems to me. You know, we're losing contact with the American literary past, I think. But I don't control the curriculum of high school, so I can't. I don't know. I don't know why. I think I know. I have a lot of poet friends who are crazy about his poetry. They love it still, and find it a source of inspiration. And quite a few novelist friends who also are very keen on Crane. I was so happy when you and I started talking to realize how deeply you like it and appreciate it. And there are a number of others out there, but non-literary people seem to have forgotten about him. And I'm not writing for my colleagues.
Everyone to think about him. I mean, yes. I did a lot of research on him because I did an introduction years ago to a Bantam Classic edition of Maggie, and it included 4 other stories. But I remember that one of my sons read Red Badge in middle school, which is sort of
too early.
early.
too early. Your brain is not ready for
Yeah,
that. No,
but
no.
I want to bring us back to Crane a little bit. I mean, he died in 1900, and his last years, his last 6-8 months, were spent in England with Cora trying to nurse him back to health. And there's this amazing sort of period of time in which he seems to finally have found his people. He's in this incredibly damp baronial house, which was another nail in the coffin. But he becomes close friends with Ford Madox Ford and Henry James, and especially Joseph Conrad.
Yes.
The Polish native was an outsider like Crane. And during visits of several weeks, Crane actually would sit in Crane's study in silence.
Conrad
Crane
would watch
Crane would run
Crane
into the
write.
table.
Yes.
They would turn his chair around and be reading, and they were so close that they would sit there for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, and then Crane would say, "Oh, Joseph, I can't do anymore," and they would go out and play with the dogs or whatever.
Yeah.
But that friendship was so moving. It was for me, as we're getting sort of close to the end, and we know the end is coming and that the details will be there, but those moments were so moving.
To me too, and I devoted a whole chapter to the friendship and the first phase of it before Crane went to Cuba. Crane had been reading Conrad. Conrad certainly read Crane, and I think was very influenced by Crane.
Mm-hmm.
Conrad was 14 years older, but he had gotten a much later start as a writer. So Crane was better known at that moment.
Mm-hmm.
But, in that early period, imagine that, Conrad wrote Heart of Darkness, and the letter that Conrad writes to Crane about the garbage, the crap that he's writing, and this disgustingly stupid thing he's written called Heart of Darkness, which is now considered, one of the great classics of modern writing, and justifiably. They were so hard on themselves, Conrad especially. There's another thing people should know about writers: how we are never satisfied, and how difficult it is to really write anything decent. Anyway, they were brothers under the skin, and they had very similar personalities, and they were both ferocious, and they had a kind of almost silent friendship. They never talked about the past together. They just lived in the moment together, and they could go through long periods not saying anything, as you mentioned, and but at the same time, Crane had a much bigger sense of humor than Conrad did, and he could be quite funny and charming when he wanted to be, really almost zany, and he kept
You
wanting.
talked about the thing with the dogs with the combs.
Yeah, they would do all kinds of
activities after hard work.
The concerts with the dogs singing, and anyway, he kept wanting to collaborate with Conrad on a play so they could make some money, and Crane kept coming up with new ideas. And one of their mutual friends, Edward Garnett, the critic,
Constant Garnett.
Yeah, Constant Garnett's husband, he loves both Crane and Conrad, and describing Crane jumping around, saying, "Joseph, look, we'll put, it's a shipwreck, and they wind up on a desert island, and Conrad,
they eat their hearts."
Yeah, would be smiling, and he was just so amused by Crane's enthusiasm, but those are the only moments. Otherwise, they were just, as Conrad said, we would respond to each other's work with a grunt, and that was it. That was the highest sign of approval.
And of course, it is so ironic that all his life, virtually, Crane was in debt and struggling for money and living off credit, living large off credit, as though there were no tomorrow. Because from the very, very early on in his life, he said that he would die young.
Yeah.
And people did observe sometimes that he seemed almost so unconscious of danger in war zones and etc. that it was almost, and there were so many acts of pure courage, when he walked 6 miles to to get medical help for an injured correspondent who worked for a rival newspaper.
Yeah, and deliver his dispatch to
fired
the other paper. Yes, yes, in
Exactly.
Cuba.
To
Yeah.
the dispatch. Someone just asks, did he have an editor he liked? I don't know if we could say that he did.
I think Ripley Hitchcock, sort of, who was the first, who edited Red Badge of Courage and other books. I don't know how much anyone actually interfered with Crane's prose. To some degree, I mean, I know that Crane was on his trip out west and was in New Orleans when he got the typed up finished version of Red Badge. And for about a week, he sat with it and he cut out 2,000 words. But this was Crane did this himself. About 2,000 words. He chopped off the ends of a lot of chapters. He dropped a whole chapter, and he did revise it. He understood that it needed some cuts, but Hitchcock, I don't think, was really involved in that at all.
Mm-hmm.
So no, I don't think he did. No, he didn't work with editors that closely.
He worked with Cora closely.
Yes, and to such a degree that after a while he was dictating things, money projects to keep them afloat. And more her handwriting began to resemble his. They were very close, and it's a fascinating story. And she herself is a fascinating person. And I know today where Elizabeth Friedman is here. She announced herself. Hi, Elizabeth. And Elizabeth has written a wonderful biography of Cora. She's finishing it up, and Elizabeth
I
was
can't wait to read
very helpful to me, in giving me information about Cora that had not been previously known. And Cora was an independent woman in the late 19th century, early 20th.
He was actually born in the upper middle class, or even
yes,
like Crane.
Yeah, and but she was someone who did not succumb to the pieties and conventions of that late Victorian world. And
but we're getting close to our time limit.
We are.
There
Yes.
is no time limit for Stephen Crane. But Paul, I wonder if you would read it's the penultimate graph of the book because it ends with Stephen's words. But if you could read that little paragraph beginning.
I will. This was Jayne-Anne's suggestion. I'm perfectly happy to do it. This is this is on page 738, the last page of the book. I did put in the dates in which I wrote the book, October 2017 to February 2020. So in other words, just before the pandemic shut everything down, I finished writing the text. I had all the notes and other things to do and proofreading during the pandemic lockdown, but not the text itself. So here it is. He was no one, then he was someone. He was adored by many, despised by many, and then he disappeared. He was forgotten. He was remembered. He was forgotten again. He was remembered again. And now, as I write the last sentences of this book, in the early days of 2020, his books are being forgotten again. It is a dark time for America, a dark time everywhere. With so much happening to erode our certainties about who we are and where we are going next, perhaps the moment has come to dig the burning boy out of his grave and start remembering him again. The prose still crackles, the eye still cuts, the work still stings. Does any of this matter to us anymore? If it does, and one can only hope that it does, attention must be paid.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for this incredible book.
Thank you, Jayne-Anne, for reading it so closely and asking such good questions.
Well, we have a couple of minutes left. So is there anything we didn't talk about that you'd like to just kind of put into the conversation?
Let me think. Yes, there is one thing about his journalism, which
Right.
people have tended to dismiss it as just money work, but it wasn't. Some of these pieces are as good as any of the literary work he did, and it is literary work. There was a form of writing that no longer exists that was prevalent in the 1890s, and perhaps even after, called the sketch. And the sketch was a form of journalism that did not adhere to what we would consider to be journalism today. Um, and so, for example, one of the first ones that Crane did is called The Men in the Storm. It was written in February 1894. 1893, the panic of 1893 started. It was the worst economic depression in the history of the country. It lasted for 5 years. Unemployment in New York was 30 to 35%. There were homeless men everywhere. A blizzard struck New York one afternoon. Crane ran out of his apartment and he went downtown to the Bowery, where he knew there was a shelter that was allowing men in at a certain time. They would open the doors, and for a nickel, they could get a bed for the night and a cup of coffee and a roll in the morning. And he just goes out there and watches the men shivering in this blizzard. He himself was shivering in the blizzard. He didn't wear an overcoat. He didn't even have a sweater or a scarf. And he stood there for hours writing about them or watching them. And then he went home.
Didn't he get pneumonia?
No,
No,
but
not that time?
it was not that time. He got pneumonia other times, but not this time. But he went home, and immediately on the heels of this experience, he wrote 7 beautiful pages about what he had seen, collapsed and went to sleep. His friend, C.K. Linson, an artist who loved Crane and wrote a book about him later, came to check up on him, see how he was doing, because he knew he was going out. Now, today, anyone writing this piece would have to interview men in the line waiting for the door to open.
And get their names and info.
Exactly. And if they were willing to give their name, and also you'd have to begin the piece by saying, well, what is the panic of 1893? What are the conditions that are driving men to look for shelter like this? Crane does none of that. Today, a journalist would be obliged to go inside once the door opens and talk to the people running the place. You'd have to describe it. How many beds are there? You know, how many people do they accommodate every day, every week, every month? Who's financing this thing? Is it a philanthropist or is it some kind of public charity?
And this was like Crane's sense impressions of exactly what he was saying. I just want to ask you before we end. I heard something about a new anthology of Crane's work that will include fiction and some of this important nonfiction that you mentioned.
Oh.
Is that something that would be a great thing for
American? I don't know who's doing it and how big will it be. Do you know? You just.
I hope it's going to be quite substantial.
Because I was hoping to do one, and then it didn't work out. My publisher Picador, they said finally, we don't have the education department that could get this out properly. So.
I'm sure there's someone out there who.
Oh, there is, and I want to do it myself, but I'm so burned out on this right now, and I've been working on other things. Maybe in a little while, I'll feel the gumption to write, say, a 20-page essay on Crane.
After a little sleep.
After a little sleep, I even asked you, Jayne-Anne, if you'd like to do it. You said no, I should do it, but
you should do it.
We should discuss.
You have this anthology in your mind.
Yeah. No, I've written it all out. I know what I want in there. It would be about 650 pages, and sort of cover the waterfront as best you can.
Exactly.
Yeah. So anyway, he is available. The Library of America edition's out there, and it's really a great way to begin, I would say. And then if you really get interested, go for the collected works.
The University of Virginia.
Yeah, and they are available, and it's not that expensive to buy. So,
Well, thank you, Paul. Thank you for writing this book. I think we're almost to the end. We have 3 minutes, and I think someone is coming on to say
goodbye, hello, goodbye. Yes.
And where are you going right after this, Paul?
I'm going to, I live in Brooklyn, and I'm going to be picked up in about an hour, and I'm going to the Brooklyn Book Festival, Writers Festival, whatever it's called. And I'm going to do a conversation with Joyce Carol Oates, who also lives in New Jersey. It was apparently in Montclair yesterday. So we're like little billiard balls bouncing around the table here.
New Jersey's moment.
That's
Absolutely.
right.
Absolutely. Jayne-Anne, I can't thank you enough. Thank you so much.
Paul, it was really fun.
Yeah.
I love Stephen Crane, and I think you've done a wonderful job
Thank
bringing
you.
him back to us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. That was such a wonderful talk. And Paul, the ending of your book is so beautiful. I can't wait to read it. Paul's book is available to pre-order in the link. So our authors all appear for free. So please support them by buying their books. Our next talk will be at noon with, thank you both so much. Our next talk will be at noon with Tiffany Yannick, talking about her new book, Monster in the Middle. And at 1 o'clock, join us for a conversation about the bestseller, The Personal Librarian. Thank you all for joining us today.